The night was cold, eerily still, as if the wind itself held its breath over the narrow iron bridge stretching above Miller's Gorge. Beneath it, the icy river carved its way through the rocky chasm like a scar etched into the earth. The moon hung high, ghost-pale and quiet, casting long silver shadows that danced across the steel rails. On that bridge stood two men, one old and bent with time, the other younger, with clenched fists and a storm in his eyes. And a third soul, unseen, watched from the darkness, silent, loyal, and fated to remember. Henry Bellamy had built his empire with calloused hands and sleepless nights. Now in his 70s, he was no longer the powerful figure he once was, but his heart still beat for the company he founded, a construction firm that shaped half the town's skyline. For years, his most trusted protégé had been Blake Rudd, a smart, driven man in his 30s who saw in Henry both a mentor and an obstacle. "Why did you bring me out here, Blake?" Henry's voice was strained, his breath clouding the air. "It's freezing." Blake stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Because this is where it ends." The words hung heavy, unnatural. Before Henry could respond, Blake's hands shot forward. One violent shove. Henry stumbled, arms flailing, eyes wide in disbelief. And then he vanished over the edge. No scream, only the sound of water breaking against rock far below. It was done. Blake stood there, panting, shaking, not from remorse, but adrenaline. His lips curled into a cruel smirk. "Old fool," he muttered. "You never saw it coming." But what Blake didn't know was that he wasn't alone. In the thicket near the bridge's edge, hidden behind the shadow of a half-fallen pine, a pair of intelligent, heartbroken eyes stared through the darkness. Henry's German shepherd, Brutus, had followed them. He was never far from his master, trained to protect, trained to watch, and now traumatized by the impossible. Brutus did not bark, did not charge. He simply stood still, processing what he saw, committing the betrayal to memory. His heart, once proud and devoted, shattered like glass. When Blake finally turned and walked back toward his truck, he never once looked behind. He didn't see the dog step forward to the edge where Henry had disappeared, or the way Brutus sniffed the frozen ground and whimpered. Just once, soft and low, like a broken whisper into the wind. But Brutus didn't leave. He sat there, on the cold metal of the bridge, watching the river below, waiting. He would not run. He would remember. And when the time came, he would make the world remember too. Morning light poured across the gorge like spilled gold, but it brought no warmth to the figure curled at the center of the bridge. Brutus had not moved. Through the bitter night, he had kept vigil where Henry had last stood, ears pricked for a voice that would never return, eyes scanning the road for someone who would never walk it again. His body trembled, not from cold, but from grief and confusion. A passing trucker slowed at the sight, a lone dog sitting in the middle of a deserted bridge, motionless as stone. The man pulled over, called out gently, but Brutus didn't budge. When he approached, the German shepherd let out a low growl, not of aggression, but of mourning. The trucker stepped back, uneasy. He called animal control. Within an hour, a van arrived with 2 officers, both trying to coax the dog into a crate. But Brutus resisted. He bared his teeth. He barked, short, sharp bursts, directed not at the men, but at the very spot where Henry had disappeared. The officers exchanged glances. "There's something wrong with him," one muttered. "No," said the other quietly. "He's not mad. He's mourning." Still, protocol dictated removal. Brutus was eventually sedated, gently, respectfully, and taken to the local shelter, Pine Hollow Rescue. where word of the bridge dog spread quickly. The staff nicknamed him Ghost because of his haunted expression and refusal to interact with anyone. He didn't eat for 2 days, didn't sleep unless curled at the corner of his kennel, facing the door like he was waiting for someone to walk through it. But Brutus wasn't just grieving. He was watching. And while the world moved on, while Henry's disappearance was dismissed as a tragic accident, no body found, no foul play suspected, Brutus knew better. He had seen the man responsible. He had heard the final word spoken, and the scent of betrayal had lodged itself deep into his soul. Then, one evening, the bell at the shelter door rang. A girl entered, barely out of college, with warm eyes and nervous hands. Her name was Nina Bellamy, Henry's granddaughter. She had heard only rumors about her grandfather's sudden disappearance. Something hadn't felt right. She couldn't shake the feeling that no one was telling her the full truth. When she came to the shelter and locked eyes with the somber German shepherd in the back corner, something passed between them. "You knew him," she whispered. And Brutus, for the first time, stood up. The staff blinked in disbelief. "He's never done that for anyone," the director said. Brutus walked to the gate and sat. Not for food, not for treats, for her. Nina didn't understand yet. But Brutus did. He had found the one person who could help him tell the truth. And together, they were about to shake the foundation of everything Blake Rudd had buried. Brutus, once known only as Henry Bellamy's fiercely loyal companion, now sat in the back seat of Nina Bellamy's rusted hatchback, staring out the window like a soldier returning to a battlefield. The shelter workers had tried to explain that the dog was unusual, traumatized, likely a poor choice for a young woman with no training. But Nina didn't care. The moment he had stood for her, something awakened in her too. A bond she couldn't explain, a pull she couldn't ignore. She knew. This wasn't just a dog. This was her grandfather's last witness. Back at her small apartment on the edge of town, Brutus refused to rest. He paced by the windows, sniffed under the door, returned to the kitchen where Nina had laid out his new bed, then sat and stared, alert, not anxious, watchful. Nina set down a bowl of water, crouching beside him. "I know you saw something," she whispered. "They said Grandpa went missing near Miller's Gorge. But he'd never go out there alone. Not at night. Not without telling me." Brutus looked up at her then, eyes old with sorrow and truth, and something in that gaze chilled her to the bone. That night, she pulled out an old wooden box of her grandfather's letters, work files and notes from years back. She found his schedule, his phone log, a name that kept appearing, Blake Rudd. She remembered him vaguely, her grandfather's business partner, always dressed sharp, always polite. Too polite. The next morning, Nina took Brutus for a walk, but instead of a casual stroll, he tugged at the leash, hard. He wasn't walking aimlessly. He knew where he was going, and after several minutes of winding through back roads and alleyways, Nina realized they were headed in the direction of the bridge. Her heart pounded. They reached Miller's Gorge by midday. Brutus stopped at the edge of the bridge, stood tall, and let out a single, piercing bark into the cold wind. Nina stepped up beside him, heart cracking at the sight of the swirling waters far below. She crouched and touched the frost-covered guardrail, and noticed something odd. A scuffed mark in the metal, as if something had scraped against it. A smear of rust-colored residue, darkened by time. Then, half buried in the weeds beside the bridge's edge, a button. She held it up. Fine black material, gold threading. Not her grandfather's. Suddenly it was all too real. Her instincts were right. This wasn't an accident. And Brutus? He was more than a companion. He was the last thread connecting her to the truth. That night, Nina filed a report with the local police, detailing what she found. But the officer on duty, a young rookie named Jensen, simply shook his head. "There's no evidence of foul play. We looked into it weeks ago. No body, no witnesses." Nina leaned in. "There was a witness," she whispered. "He just doesn't speak your language." Jensen glanced at Brutus, confused, amused. But not everyone would laugh, because by dawn the next day, Blake Rudd would wake to find a picture on his doorstep of a German shepherd sitting at the bridge's edge, framed against the river below, and a note that read, "He never forgets." And Blake, for the first time, felt the chill of fear. Blake Rudd stood in his lavish living room, the soft hum of morning news fading into static as he stared down at the photo in his trembling hands. It had no return address, no markings, just an image printed on matte paper. A German shepherd perched at the edge of Miller's Gorge, exactly where Henry Bellamy had vanished. A dog too old, too familiar, and underneath it, scribbled in fine ink, "He never forgets." Blake's mouth ran dry. That dog, Brutus, was supposed to be locked in a kennel, half mad with grief, useless, muzzled. But now he was out, alert, and more importantly, he remembered. Blake slammed the photo down on the counter, pacing. He had been careful. He had waited for the old man to walk the bridge alone, late at night, as he often did. They'd argued that day. Henry had discovered financial discrepancies, misused funds. Blake had smoothed things over with charm, lies, and a pat on the back. But Henry wasn't stupid. He said he'd report it first thing in the morning. That night, Blake followed him. One heated confrontation. One push. No cameras. No witnesses. Or so he thought. He hadn't seen the dog, crouched low behind the pickup truck in the lot, watching with eyes that had served in combat. Зрение, обученный запоминать детали, чтобы отличать угрозу от игры. And in the silence after the splash, Brutus hadn't barked. He had simply stood there, paralyzed, a silent sentinel to his master's murder. Now, months later, that gaze was back, and it wasn't just the dog, it was her, Nina Bellamy, the quiet girl who had never asked for money, who had mourned her grandfather quietly and then disappeared. She had found the dog. She had brought him back. And worse, she had questions. Blake paced faster. He had power, influence, friends in the department. He'd sent officers to the shelter when Brutus first began acting out. He'd framed it as aggression. He'd nearly had the dog euthanized. But Nina had beaten the clock. She had saved the witness. And now, she was following the scent of blood in the water. Across town, Nina opened her laptop and clicked Send. Attached were files. The button she found, a photograph of the bridge's scuffed railing, the note her grandfather had left in his desk, the one that said, "If anything happens to me, look to the books. Start with Blake." She sent it all to Officer Jensen. Then she turned to Brutus, who sat beside her like a stone, unmoving, determined. "We need proof," she whispered. "More than shadows and scratches." Brutus barked once. Outside, tires screeched. Headlights cut through the early dusk. Nina peered through the window just in time to see a black SUV rolling to a stop across the street. A tall man stepped out, one hand tucked inside his coat. She couldn't see his face, but she didn't need to. Brutus was already growling. The man at the curb didn't knock. He stood there in the cold dusk, his coat collar high and his stance casual, but only on the surface. Nina's heart pounded as she closed her laptop and stepped back from the window, pulling the curtain just slightly closed. She glanced at Brutus, whose growl was now a low, constant vibration rumbling deep in his chest. His body was rigid, ears forward, eyes locked on the shape outside. She whispered, "It's him, isn't it?" Brutus barked sharply once. It was all the confirmation she needed. But Nina wasn't just a frightened granddaughter anymore. She was prepared. She had done her research, lined up what little she had, and shared copies with Officer Jensen, who had already begun asking questions around the station. There were others, Nina had learned. Quiet whispers from employees Henry had confided in. Odd line items in the company's books. And now this unshakable feeling that her grandfather's death wasn't just an accident swept under the rug. It was a murder covered by greed. Outside, Blake Rudd still didn't move. Instead, he took out his phone and dialed. A second later, Nina's phone lit up with a call from an unknown number. She didn't answer. Instead, she recorded everything. The man's presence, the plate on his car, and Brutus's unyielding reaction. Then she turned off the lights. She wasn't going to open the door. Not this time. Not until she had the final piece of evidence. Then her phone buzzed again. A text this time. From Jensen. "Nina, urgent. Meet me at the station. Bring Brutus. I think we have something." She didn't hesitate. Grabbing her keys and sliding on her coat, she clipped Brutus's harness and whispered, "Time to finish what we started, boy." But as she opened the back door to the alley, Blake's SUV revved and pulled forward, slowly. He had seen her escape and wasn't going to stop it. He was going to follow. For a moment, Nina hesitated. But then she looked down at Brutus, who stood tall and unwavering beside her. He wasn't just a pet anymore. He was the last living witness. And somehow, Nina believed he knew exactly what he was doing. With him by her side, fear faded into resolve. By the time she reached the station, Officer Jensen was waiting in the parking lot, papers in hand, eyes sharp. "He's here," Nina said before even saying hello. "He followed me." Jensen nodded. "Good. Let him." Inside, Jensen spread out the documents, photographs from the crime scene that had never made sense. The gouged railing, the missing phone logs, the deposit of $75,000 into Blake Rudd's account just 2 days after Henry Bellamy died. "I think this dog saw everything," Jensen said quietly. "And I think Blake knows it too." As if on cue, Brutus let out a bark so loud and fierce it shook the air. Then he turned to the door. A second later, it creaked open. And there Blake stood, calm, smiling. But this time, Brutus didn't growl. He charged. Blake barely had time to blink before Brutus surged forward, not in wild rage, but in precise, unstoppable momentum. Officer Jensen moved fast, too. He grabbed Blake's arm just as Brutus leapt and clamped his powerful jaws around the man's wrist, forcing him to the ground. Papers scattered. The waiting officers outside rushed in as Jensen shouted, "Stand down! Brutus, hold!" The German shepherd obeyed, still firm, his deep growl vibrating through the tension-choked air. Blake screamed, "Get him off me! This is illegal! That mutt's out of control!" But Brutus wasn't out of control. He was steady, calm. And as Jensen quickly handcuffed Blake, it became clear. Brutus had only acted when he sensed his master's killer in the room. Nina knelt beside the dog, whispering, "Good boy. You did it. You remembered everything, didn't you?" Blake's face twisted into panic and rage. "You don't have any proof. Nothing that ties me to that accident." Jensen dropped a file on the table as the officers dragged Blake to a chair. "No? You received a suspicious bank transfer 2 days after Henry Bellamy died. Your phone pinged at the bridge that night. And now," he added, pulling up a security camera clip from a traffic cam not far from the bridge, "we have footage showing you parked along the edge, and the same coat you're wearing now." Blake froze. Nina stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. "You killed him. My grandfather trusted you. He gave you everything." "Because I earned it," Blake hissed. "I was the one pulling the weight. I made the deals. I kept the company afloat. He was going to cut me out, after all I did." "You murdered an old man," Jensen said coldly, "and tried to cover it up like it was a tragic fall. But you didn't count on Brutus watching." Blake looked at the dog in disbelief. "It's just a stupid animal." "No," Nina said. "He's family." Later that night, the station was quiet again. Blake Rudd was in custody, and charges were being filed. News would break the next morning about a corporate betrayal and a loyal dog who had helped bring justice to a grieving granddaughter. As Jensen walked Nina and Brutus to the parking lot, he turned to her. "You know, most dogs forget trauma. They bury it. But Brutus, he remembered everything. Every movement, every detail. I've never seen anything like it." Nina nodded, her hand resting gently on Brutus's head. He didn't just see it. He held it in for months, waiting, hoping someone would believe him. The stars were out, cold and clear above the station, but for the first time in months, Nina didn't feel alone. She looked at Brutus, who sat calmly at her side, eyes glinting in the moonlight. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "You protected him, even after he was gone." And with that, they walked into the night. Brutus finally at peace, justice finally served, and Henry Bellamy's spirit carried forward in the heart of a dog who never stopped remembering. The end.